Hey, this is Wookie and Leah from Mandala Studios. Welcome to the workshop. Today we're making a latex fishy mould. This is part 2, moulding.
So we're taking our sculpt, laying it down flat. We don't need to worry about the back, so we're not pillowing the sculpt and anything because it's no sculpture on the back of this one.
We're doing a 2-part mould this time, so most of the front of it will be on one piece, and you'll see we'll cut in so that the thin and over the top of the head is a second piece that we'll do later.
So we're building up just blocks of foam so we can get up to the right height for the split line without using all the clay in the world.
And at this point we're working out where our clay wall's going to go and popping the clay in to fit that, trying to get a nice smooth wall.
Yeah, we're just building up the level here. You can see I'm sectioning the point off where we're going to split the mould from the front to the back. I'm doing it at this weird curve so that if there's any visible seam line remnant at the end, it sort of follows the sculptural lines of the piece, so it doesn't look out of place if it goes horribly wrong later. And we're just making a nice neat clay wall that runs over the chin there.
Yeah, we want this to be nice and smooth as possible.
You can see I'm pushing the clay carefully up to the surface. I can do this because of the spray paint on it. The spray paint adds a little bit of protective layer so that the clay doesn't stick to the wet clay we used before, and the pressure doesn't just leave a horrible crease line in the sculpt.
There's a bit more smoothing with a wet brush there, and a bit more sealing with a wet brush.
Yeah, just to make sure we're going right to the edge so that plaster doesn't spray out the back.
So this is putting in key points, and so that when we do the second part we have the key points for the two to lock together.
Yeah, just spin a round loop tool. Now I'm just adding some vertical walls around the sides here so that when I make the plaster pour, the edge easily builds up some thickness, because sometimes if you're doing it and you're just brushing, it tends to thin out to nothing and it's very hard to see exactly where the edge of your mould is.
It gives them a nice solid mould with a clearly defined edge. Right, so now we're ready to put some plaster in.
We're using Herculite 2 plaster as normal here. It's a good mix alpha beta plaster.
Gives us strength and definition.
Yeah, it's not the hardest in the world, but it works well for what we use it for, and I really like the working profile.
Captures a nice amount of detail. We're letting it slake there. Yeah. And then mixing it up. This is our splash coat, so it's usually quite a thin coat, the first coat we do. And you've got to cover everything to capture all the details. And you want to make sure you've done that in one go.
Yep, you'll see it beading off slightly. That's just because the plaster on the mould, on the surface of the paint, doesn't quite stick, but it works itself out as it gets thicker. You'll see there that we changed sides.
Yep, and I think we can change back again in a minute. There we go.
And the reason we do this is that if either of us has a systematic error in the way we're working on any given project on any given day,
yep,
the other person moving to that previously done side will hopefully fix it, because we're both unlikely to have the same mistake on any given thing. And
we apply plaster very differently, don't we? Yeah. So
second layer, so we're taking some warm water, sprinkling in a layer of plaster evenly over the surface until the plaster stops being absorbed by the water. Then you leave it to slake. You can see it in the background, slowly all turning a grey colour rather than white. Once it's all completely saturated, good to go.
And this layer we're putting Hessian in because it adds strength to the mould, it gives us a stronger mould. So we're soaking the Hessian completely in plaster. We're also laying it onto the mould in such a way that it doesn't have edges sticking out. So
we fold it in half, put the folded edge around the outside.
So any stringy bits are in the middle and completely encased in plaster.
And we just keep layering it over. You want 2 layers of Hessian all the way around, normally we do. And then we're just using the remainder of the plaster to build up more thickness and encase the Hessian layer. Yep. We often do 2 or 3 layers on a mould depending on how much plaster we've made up.
And the Hessian will go in either the middle one or the top one.
Then we're brushing over the surface to get a relatively smooth, even surface. Personally, I want my moulds to be fairly even but not completely glass smooth, because handling wet moulds later as you're moving around the workshop, I like a bit of texture on them.
And we're smoothing down the edges there in order to give us a mould that's you know, if it's got nice smooth edges, A, they're not going to hurt you, you're not going to cut yourself on them, and B, if you drop it, it's not got sharp edges that will mean the moulds are more likely to break.
No stress risers. Now we take off the clay from around the outside, and that exposes the whole thing. Then we just clean up.
You can see the keys quite nicely there, and just putting a little bit of texture back in where we've obviously lent on it.
I just damaged it when I took it off.
Yeah.
Took the clay off. I don't do it with a finger.
So this is moulding the second part, so we're going to repeat the process, but we're keeping it upright this time, and we're building a support structure out of clay in order to hold the wall in place.
Yeah, I could have done this lying it down on its front, but it seemed easier to get the position I wanted with the sockets for the foam rods in this position, so I did it like this. So we again create a relatively even wall. You see it's not perfectly even, but it's back of the head, the whole sculpt's not perfect there, or not perfectly even. Again, making a little vertical wall so that it captures the edge of the clay, plaster, sorry. And you see there I'm putting in some little pry points. They're just little blocks of clay that will create voids when we come to demould, so that we've got somewhere to put our pry bars.
I remember on this one we had quite a lot of talk about how we were going to make sure we didn't lock the sculpt onto the head, because the main sculpt doesn't go back as far as the ears, and your head gets narrow just in front of your ears.
You can see there I'm just putting in some Vaseline onto the exposed plaster, and then giving it a quick spray of Mac Wax release agent just to make sure the plaster layers don't bond. You saw there some nicely slaked plaster, and again just brush that detail coat on, making sure I get it right the way into those sockets with hopefully no air bubbles in the bottom of those sockets. Then it just thickens up. I can apply the layer going around, making sure I get it into the keys and all around the edge to get some body of material where the edge will be exposed. Layer 2, mix up some more plaster, mix in some soak in some Hessian, lay it round again, folded edges to the outside so it's neat, and just lay it over, 2 layers over the whole thing. If you notice there I put a completely dry layer on, that's because the plaster was a little bit wet on the surface and a bit too much put on, so I'm just using the Hessian to absorb some of that plaster to keep the whole thing under control. And then again just go over it with a brush to create a pretty smooth but not perfectly smooth thing.
Yep, and then clean up the edges, same as we did before. Make sure that there's no sharp edges, no weird cut-ins or odd shapes.
Then clean off the
clay and keep cleaning up your edges. There we go. And then I believe once that's done, once everything's ready, we leave it overnight. More clay coming off.
If you notice that I was just making the edge a bit softer with my fingers as well.
Yeah. Here we are, demoulding and cleaning. So the next day, climb back. Cleaning out our pry holes, and you can see we're getting the pry bars in there. Pry holes don't go all the way to the surface of the sculpt there on the edge, so we are using metal tools there, which we've got to be really careful because they will damage the plaster if we're not careful with them.
Yeah, you only ever use them in the flange around the edge, never on the sculpt itself.
Yep. Opening up the roller shutter door. There we go. And I'm wearing sandals, but it's not a proper pressure washer. I'm not going to flay my feet with this one. And we're cleaning out the rest of the clay from the moulds.
You see there I'm cleaning out some of the spray paint which stuck. That's why using the spray paint's actually quite helpful. If I was to pour latex in the mould as is, you'd see thin patches, so I clean out the paint so it's perfectly clean, as you can see now.
So start with here, Wookie is going through with some thin plaster, just making sure that any little gaps, air bubbles, that sort of thing have been patched up.
Yeah, I'm putting the
and
seam
then
inside.
Also, sorting out the seam around the top of the head.
Because we want to make this as a single part mould ultimately, so we patch the 2 halves together permanently.
Yep.
And to do that, we just add a bit of plaster, seal it up, bit of tape to hold it together, plaster the inside, plaster the outside, lock those keys up, smooth plaster of the whole thing, and that should dry into a single solid unit.
So we haven't shown you the ear sculpt here, but it's a really simple 15-minute sculpt. It's just got the 5 sockets for the backer rod and bring them together into one part. We're building a little box for it out of foam board. and we're going to pour this mould. Now obviously with this one because it's got the sockets, it's got some interesting undercuts that we're going to have to make sure we've got properly filled. Sealing that up with clay to make sure that we don't get plaster leaking out. And then we're going to make up some plaster.
So we're mixing up this plaster just as normal, but we're making it a little thinner than normal, so it won't be as stiff, so that when we pour it in we shouldn't get any air bubbles into the thing. You see,
slaking.
It's not quite as covered all the way to the edges as normal.
Yeah.
Leave it to slake.
Still got some little white bits, I'll wait for those to fade. There we go.
Mix
And
it up.
then we pour it in.
Pour it into the lowest point, let it rise to itself.
And then bang on the table a lot.
Angle it, bang on the table, whatever you need to do. Just try and get all those air bubbles out.
Yeah.
Rip
There you
apart
get your box.
rip apart the mould, then just form off the edges, and you've got a perfect block mould.
Thank you for watching.